Hello! Today we are talking about my best SFF picks of the year. These are science fiction and fantasy books that I read in 2021. Not necessarily books that were released in 2021, though some were. These are just what I read that I most enjoyed this year. This was an interesting year for me in general. Now that I'm like looking at my end of the year lists and some of the ratings and stuff, I think this is the first one you guys are seeing. I had a lot of 4-star books this year, and for me a 4-star is, let's call that like an A- kind of a book, but not that many 4.5 and 5 stars. So in particular on this list, I have 1 5-star and then I had a bunch of 4 stars to pick from. So that was interesting. Also, this was a year where I read a lot of middle grade and YA fantasy sci-fi stuff, and that hasn't necessarily been the case the last few years. I think frankly that's just because it's been sort of like a comfort thing, particularly middle grade. During crazy time in our world, that has been something that I have very much enjoyed kind of retreating into as a comfort kind of thing. So anyway, all that to say, this list feels very different than past lists in terms of what all's on here, but we're just gonna roll with it. These are all books that I really enjoyed, so we'll start at the bottom and work our way up. Number 10 is Where the Drowned Girls Go by Shauna Maguire. Now, this is, I know, gonna be infuriating to some of you because this is actually a book that is not yet come out. This comes out in January of 2022, but it was one of my favorite things I read in 2021. And this is the, I wanna say the 6th book, is that right? 7th book, I guess, in the Wayward Children series from Shauna Maguire. And this one in particular delighted me because I feel like it was definitely a progression for the series as a whole on a macro plot level, because in this book, we explore and go to a different school for children who have gone through a portal to a fantasy world and come back. It is not as benevolent as the Wayward Children that we have been spending most of our time at. We also are spending a lot of time in this one with Cora, who's one of my favorite recurring characters in the series. I mean, nobody will top Jack. Jack for life, Jack for president, but Cora is one of my favorite characters in the series. I'm still shipping her and Christopher, though maybe it's gonna end up being her and Cade, but this is one where we get a lot from her. And I think thematically, this is a really interesting book in terms of addressing fat phobia in a way that I really appreciated. And these books tend to be pretty direct in their thematic content. Like, it's not hidden, it's not a mystery. But in this particular case, I feel like that really worked. I liked what this kind of did for the series as a whole on a macro plot level. And all in all, definitely one of my favorite SFF picks of the year. Next, we have a very underhyped book that I wasn't on my radar, but the author, I guess, actually watches this channel and reached out to me and offered me an ARC. This came out from Simon & Schuster, I think at the beginning of the year, and it's called The Girl from Shadow Springs by Ellie Cipher. I wanted to put this on the list because I feel like this was a really beautifully written book. So I felt like this was very evocative of its winter setting in particular. The setup for this is that this is sort of like a, maybe kind of like a post-apocalyptic type Western US. It's definitely a Western, it's like a YA fantasy Western. And actually the next one we're gonna talk about on this list is also a YA fantasy Western. But this one is a retelling of the Snow Queen mythos. So it is a wintry version of a YA fantasy Western. And our main character is trying to survive on the frontier with her little sister. Her little sister is taken from her after she accidentally finds something she wasn't supposed to find. Our main character does. She has to enlist the help of somebody who was killed on an expedition. His nephew teams up with her. So it's sort of like a road trip kind of book, but it also ends up just being a lot about sisterhood, and it goes to this sort of myth retelling place that I wasn't necessarily expecting at the beginning of it. So all in all, I just really liked this. I felt like it was very underhyped this year and well worth seeking out if you appreciate genre bending YA fantasy that is very well written. Like, the actual prose is nice, and this is particularly evocative of winter, so if you need something to kind of snuggle up with, I think that this could be a good one. And by the way, I'm sorry it got so dark in here. The sun was out and now it's hidden, so we're just gonna deal with the sort of backlit vibes of this. I hope you guys are into that. Let's think of it as sort of like a warm Christmas tree kind of glow. Number 8 is Deathless Divide by Justina Ireland, and this is the finale in a duology that started with Dread Nation, and this is also a YA fantasy Western, but one that has a very different vibe than The Girl from Shadow Springs. I feel like that this was a really worthy finale to the story that got set up in Dread Nation thematically. Now, I will say from a plot perspective, very different vibes in this from the first one. So I see why this came out, I think, in 2020, and there was a pretty mixed reaction to this book in particular. And I can see that because I do think that it's a very different plot vibe than the first one had. But I actually really liked where this book ended up going because what it was doing in its plot, I think, was a really insightful and thought-provoking progression on the themes introduced in the first one, particularly around questions of identity and passing, which has been a big part of the Black American story, and I feel like this talked about that in a very interesting way. I really liked hearing from Catherine as a point of view character in this one. Overall, I just felt like this was a really good progression to this series. It wasn't as good to me as Dread Nation, but I do feel like it was still very thought-provoking, interesting. I enjoyed reading it, and actually I did this, several of these I did as buddy reads, I just realized, with Leanna. This is one we buddy read together, and we both had, I think, a pretty similar reaction, that we liked it much more than it seems like sort of the consensus was when it came out. Then number 7 is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. This came out, I think, in 2014, so I'm way late to the party on this one, but it's definitely emerging, I think, as sort of a modern sci-fi space opera type classic, and I totally see why. The comparison that gets made for this one pretty often is to Firefly. I think that's an apt comparison because I would describe this as very character-driven space adventure. I really enjoyed spending time with these characters. I think the world building in particular, I thought, was very well unspooled to the reader in a way that was detailed but not info dumpy, and I think that that is a real skill, and it seems like that, in my opinion, is one that Becky Chambers does have. I do think that for me, I don't know that I got to the end of this book and was like, I'm surprised this is a series. I don't think I will actually continue on in this series because I just feel like I got what I wanted to from this cast of characters. I really enjoyed my time with this cast of characters. My particular favorites were Lovey and Kizzy. It's an entire cast of very lovable characters, maybe except for Corbin. They're all lovable in their own unique way. We get to spend time with all of them, and I liked the plot of it pretty well. I felt like the pacing was a little not totally working for me, but overall very well written. Like the actual prose of this, I think, is very high quality. And if you're somebody like me who is a very character-driven reader for speculative fiction, I definitely think this is a crowd pleaser. So I'm not gonna keep going in the series, but I really enjoyed this kind of as a standalone, and I do think it works as a standalone. And yeah, I really like this. I thought this was real great. Number 6 is A Master of Djinn by P. Djeli Clark. This is the 3rd book in his series that started with A Dead Djinn in Cairo, and this is his first full novel that I'm aware of, at least. He has been working mostly in novellas and short stories up to this point, of which I think he is a literal master. Like, I think he is one of the most talented novella writers I've ever encountered. This is his first foray into a full novel. I do think you feel that, and that is the one criticism I have of this book, is that it feels almost like an interconnected series of novellas rather than feeling fully like a cohesive novel. But with that criticism to the side, I think that the character work in this is fantastic. Fatma continues to be a very compelling main character. She's sort of the setup for this is that it's a sort of like an urban fantasy steampunk kind of vibe in Cairo in the 20s, but with sort of like Jinn magic, so Jinn and Ifrit and that type of magical system. And but also coexisting with ancient gods of Egypt, as well as Islam. So I think there's a lot of sort of different religious and mythological influences on this story that make for a very compelling and thought-provoking world. And then it's also, Fatma is our queer dandy detective a la Poirot. So we're getting a detective story in the midst of that setting, and also she has like this romance going on with this woman who is like kind of a priestess of one of the ancient Egyptian gods. So it's just, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in this series, and particularly in this book. I do think, like I said, the pacing was a bit off, but overall very thought-provoking thought-provoking, very fun. This is my kind of book that, like, I am a sucker for a speculative world with a mystery plot engine and some romance thrown in. That's my perfect kind of book, and that's exactly what this delivers. So for that reason, this just like speaks to what I really enjoy in books quite directly, and therefore I really love the series. The writing is fantastic, like the actual prose quality is very high. Just, I love this series. I really am looking forward to more from him in the series, but just from him in general. He is basically an auto-buy author for me at this point. Number 5 is Amari and the Night Brothers by B.B. Alston. This is his middle grade fantasy debut novel that is the first in, I'm not sure if it's a series or a trilogy, but there's gonna be more books to come. This was an incredibly strong debut, I think, and does what I like best in middle grade fantasy, which is, it is humorous, it is very wholesome in its overall tone and feeling. There's a lot of emphasis, obviously, on friendship and family and found family, but also this has this very intriguing fantasy magical setup where our heroine's older brother was in this magical kind of CIA type agency and went missing. She doesn't know why, she doesn't know about that society, and neither does her mom, but she gets invited to essentially like apprentice for the agency, and she is trying to find out what happened to him and discover potentially powers that she herself has. So I just felt like this was really, everybody hyped this up to me who had read it earlier in the year, and I totally agree. This gave me the feeling that I want to have while reading middle grade fantasy. This evoked it, and I think the characters were particularly strong. He is particularly skilled at writing villains. Like, I really hated some of the villains. And also thematically, I thought this was a very interesting exploration really of class and how that impacts opportunities and perspectives on the world, etc. So all around, I just love this, and I'm very excited for the next one. Number 4, dun da da, is Fugitive Telemetry from Martha Wells. I don't know how much I really need to say about this. I am a well-known, high priestess in the Church of the Good News of Murderbot. I love Murderbot as a character, period. I know that there are people who don't like the series because they feel like there's not enough world building. For me in a novella, that's kind of part of the deal. I'm somebody who's a very passionate advocate for shorter speculative works because I feel like there can be, among fans of sci-fi and fantasy, can be an over premium on very detailed world building, which is not something that I come to speculative stories for. So I am actually quite a big fan of shorter works like this, where really what we're getting are sort of the sketches and the contours of the world that suggest at a lot of interesting things, but doesn't get too, frankly, like masturbatory in the detailed description. Just pages and pages of descriptions of political structures or magic or science, whatever. That's not really what I'm coming for. I'm coming for that as the overall backdrop, and then I want compelling characters with an interesting story. That's like really what I'm coming for. And to me, the Murderbot Diaries series delivers on that because I love the character of Murderbot so much. And this particular entry is literally Murderbot being a murder mystery detective because there is a murder at the base that they are at, and their person is in danger, so they have to like figure out what's going on. That just works for me. We get some of the characters that we know and love from earlier works. We get some new ones that are interesting and new connections to new characters, which is fun. I think if you enjoy the series, and if you're like me and you like a murder mystery, you will particularly very much enjoy this. But yeah, this delivered. This like gave what it was supposed to give for me and for other people who enjoy this series. Okay, we are now in our top 3, which is gonna end up being a cheat, and you will see why. But I will say that number 3 and 2 are both in the realm of the Elderling series, but they are in 2 different trilogies within the series. So for that reason, I decided that I was allowed to have them stand as their own entries on the list as number 3 and 2 respectively. So first, we've got Royal Assassin from Robin Hobb. This is the second book in the first trilogy of the realm of the Elderlings, which is the original like Fitz Farseer trilogy. This is the beautiful illustrated edition that they've recently started putting out. Definitely my favorite of this original trilogy. It starts with Assassin's Apprentice and ends with Assassin's Quest. This is Royal Assassin, and to me this is sort of like an Empire Strikes Back kind of situation where the second book in the trilogy is the strongest. I think that this has really great character development building on what we learned in Assassin's Apprentice about Fitz, who is a royal bastard with a specific gifting, magic-wise, that has been banished. And so he has to try to both learn that magic, but also somewhat keep it a secret. And he's also training to, yes, be an assassin, but really he's like taking his place in the court and in the political machinations. And this series from Robin Hobb is incredibly character driven. Some of the best character writing I've seen in fantasy. The prose itself, I feel like this is a refrain, and you're seeing that that is something I clearly value in most of my sci-fi fantasy reading. The prose itself is incredibly high quality from Robin Hobb. And this one, I think the reason it is definitely my favorite of the original trilogy is because the ending, it literally made my jaw drop. I was buddy reading this with Leanna, and I was like, you have to let me know when you finish this, because I read it before she did. I was like, we have to talk about this. I can't even really get into the substance of it because it would be spoilers, and also just like you wouldn't get the impact unless you've read the book. But one of the best cliffhanger / endings of a book in fantasy I've ever read. So definitely my favorite of the original trilogy, and I think just an incredible testament to what the value is of really spending time with and like living in character relationships can do. I also think that the relationships in this are just so well rendered, both romantic, platonic, familial, like all of the different relationships that Fitz has are just very well rendered and very interesting. So this is my third favorite book of the year in sci-fi fantasy. My second favorite book of the year in sci-fi fantasy was Ship of Magic by Robin Hobb, which is the first book in the second trilogy of the Realm of the Elderling series, which is the Live Ship Trader series. And I would say that this is my favorite Robin Hobb book to date. Now, I am about to read The Mad Ship, which is the second book in the trilogy, and I have expectations that that will become my new favorite. But for now, this is my favorite in Robin Hobb's oeuvre that I've read so far. Unlike the original trilogy in the series, the second trilogy has multiple point of view, and it is very close point of view for each of the characters you're following, but it's not as deep as you get into Fitz's point of view in the original trilogy. So if that is what put you off the original trilogy, I would say that you could start here. I so far do prefer this. It is in the same world, and I am told that once you get through the whole series of the Realm of the Elderlings, you see what happens in this book and how it connects back to what's happening with Fitz. So far, I don't know how that ties in, but I'll find out at some point, I guess. But I just love, I mean, the villains in this are so hateable, like Kyle Haven, I hate. I think that this has so much to say about family. The political machinations are interesting. The world building is cool. We get like a different point of view on what we'd been seeing in the original trilogy in terms of like what is known about that area. The concept of having ships that are alive is such a cool world building concept, and I think she totally pulls it off. The ships themselves, like that's some of my favorite character work in this book. We've got like a lady pirate, or somebody who's attempting to be like a lady merchant. This just goes a lot of interesting places thematically. Like I think there's really interesting stuff about religion in this, especially at the end. It goes a lot of interesting places thematically. The character work is great, and the world building is there. And the plot itself, I was more interested in this round of it. So all in all, second favorite fantasy book of the year. Very excited to get to the next book in the trilogy. This just generally reading 3 books in this series this year felt like a big kind of like big rocks in my jar of fantasy reading for the year. And I did all those with Leanna. So thank you to Leanna for being my co-sojourner through the land of the Elderlings. And we will continue trekking along next year. And then, dun-da-da, we're at the top of the list. Now, here's the thing. This is somewhat of a cheat because it is 3 books, not 1. And that is because 3 books on my original top 10 were all in the exact same series. And I just felt like that was too much. So I decided to consolidate them all into the top slot. And that is, I had at number 10, Titan's Curse by Rick Riordan. That got 4 stars. I had at number 2 originally, The Battle of the Labyrinth by Rick Riordan. This got 4.5 stars. And then unquestionably my favorite fantasy book of the year is Percy Jackson and the Last Olympian by Rick Riordan. And this is my only 5-star SFF pick for the year. Now, I'm so late to the game on this. I did not grow up reading Percy Jackson because I was slightly too old for them when they were first coming out. And I thought, you know, I was too much of a snob at that point as like a 14-year-old or whatever I was to want to read it. But I've come back to these as an adult. And I will tell you that I think this is my new favorite YA or middle grade fantasy series ever, because I love the macro plot of this. Part of what I think is very interesting about this series is that the first two books are really good. Like, they're solid middle grade fantasy. Concept is super fun, which is basically Greek mythology, but in our world and like a fantasy version of it. Middle grade, it's very action adventure oriented, very humorous, and actually his humor works very well for me, I guess, because in my heart I am a 12-year-old boy, so there you go. But the humor is there, you know, it's middle grade, so it has this themes of friendship and family that I love. So the first two books were good, but starting in Titan's Curse, the macro plot of it really picks up steam. So it definitely got I mean, for sure it's established in The Lightning Thief and continued in The Sea of Monsters, but it really takes off in Titan's Curse. And where the macro plot goes, I love. I love the different themes we get along the way. I like the way that the tension escalates over the course of the books in terms of like what the stakes are. I really enjoy the character work in this in particular. And just the fact that this is called And the Last Olympian, like, you have to read the book to get what that means. But what that statement says thematically about where Uncle Rick sees the weight of the series going, I think is beautiful. Like, I just love this. And in 2020, I mean, I started this in 2020 and finished the series in I want to say this is one of the first things I read in the year. I think I read this in like January. So this was really like my pandemic comfort read. And this just was what my weary soul needed. And I just loved it. This just hit me where I needed it to. Do you have books that just meet you in your moment and therefore you love them all the more? I definitely think that Percy Jackson as a whole qualifies for that, but then particularly The Last Olympian. This is unquestionably my favorite SFF book of the year, and I just love it. It's one of my all-time favorite books now, and I've really enjoyed continuing on in the Heroes of Olympus. I haven't loved any of those as much as I loved The Titan's Curse, though I've given all of them 4 stars so far, but I'm hopeful. I'm in the middle of the Mark of Athena right now, and I've been told that the back half of this series, much like Percy Jackson, things get really intense and real. So I'm excited for that to fully kick in. And yeah, I'm an Uncle Rick convert in the last year and a half or so, and this book is definitely far and away my favorite from him so far, and it's definitely the top of the list for me. 5 stars. Love it. So with that concludes my best of SFF for this year. Definitely let me know how your reading for sci-fi fantasy books went in 2021. Did you have any big hits? Did you have any big disappointments? Were you like me and just comfort reading middle grade and YA fantasy all over the place? Let me know that in the comments below. And yes, I think that will do it for this video. So if you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below, and I think that will do it. I hope you're having an absolutely lovely day today, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye!